Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another session of LubeTrends. Today, we are going to be talking about the top 5 OSHA violations and how to avoid them. I think that's a topic that has a lot of interest, and hopefully you'll find today's session to be very informative. I want to take a minute to introduce the panelists. And to thank our sponsor, Chevron Ornite. Chevron Ornite has been with us since we started LubeTrends several years ago, and really want to thank them for their participation all these years. First panelist today is Cullen Wise. He's the Vice President, Risk Control Services with Kendall Johnson. Prior to joining JKJ, he spent 10 years providing occupational safety compliance and loss control consultation services for numerous companies across an array of industries, including healthcare, manufacturing, construction, and more. Cullen, you can turn on your microphone and your camera if you like. Cullen specializes in workers' compensation, general liability, property protection, professional liability, and other lines of coverage. He holds the Certified Safety Professional designation and an MBA with a degree focus in strategic management from Temple University, and he's also a member of the American Society for Safety Professionals. Michael, if you'd like to turn on your microphone and camera. Michael McGuire is a vice president and partner at JKJ, where he leads the chemicals practice with clients including manufacturing and distributors of paints and coatings, lubricants and greases, water treatment and sanitary maintenance, as well as laboratory chemicals. He holds a Bachelor of Business Administration in Risk Management and Insurance from Temple University, and he's obtained both associate in risk management and chartered property and casualty underwriter designations. And last but not least, we have with us today Jeff Leiter. Jeff Leiter has been ILMA's general counsel for over 4 decades. If anyone knows ILMA member and their businesses inside out, it's Jeff. So I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. And I am going to turn this over to Michael, who's going to kick off the presentation. Thanks, Michael.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. Really appreciate everyone taking the time and ILMA for giving us the opportunity to speak to everyone today about OSHA trends and things that we've seen our clients and the industry as a whole sort of fall victim to when it comes to a safety and health standpoint. So with that, Cullen, if you want to move to the next slide, and we'll give you a rough idea of what we plan to accomplish today during the presentation. So we have 3 objectives. The first is to lay out and identify the top 5 OSHA violation standards that we see in the lubricant industry. We're going to learn about the basics of each standard, and then we're going to assist you with helping to identify what your current compliance status is. And so the agenda will look like this. Holly already gave an introduction about each of us, so we can skip through that part. We're going to actually identify the top 5. We're going to go through pretty extensively what the requirements of each standard are, and then there should be plenty of time at the end for a question and answer session. So Holly's already given you chapter and verse about Jeff, Cullen, and myself, but I'll just give you a quick background about JKJ, Johnson, Kendall, and Johnson. We're a private, independent, and employee-owned insurance brokerage and risk management consulting firm. The reason that I hit on the risk management consulting piece is because our work goes far beyond the placement of insurance. Cullen is a JKJ employee, and he and his team make thousands of visits to various client sites over the course of the year, talking to our clients and assisting them with various things related to workplace safety, fleet safety, OSHA, property and life safety, etc. We also do have, in addition to Cullen, we have in-house resources around claims and also cybersecurity. And we're about 150 20 people. That number's a little bit outdated, based out of the Philadelphia area, but we have clients in all 50 states. And kind of one of the unique things about JKJ is we actually do have employee 401k plan number one. There was a gentleman that used to work for JKJ many years ago who had identified the tax loophole that created and led to the first 401k. So pretty unique. And with that, Cullen, I'll hand things off to you to get into the top 5.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Without further ado, let's just get started on the top 5. So the OSHA top 5 violations, can see them listed here. We've got hazard communication, respiratory protection, electrical, material handling slings, and then machine guarding of mechanical power transmission apparatus. So I'm going to go through each one of these standards in pretty good detail, and then as we said earlier, give you an idea of what's required to help you assess where you are in terms of compliance with these. The way I selected these violations, the plan was to look at 1 year of inspection history for your industry, identified as petroleum, lubricating oil, and grease manufacturing. However, the 1 year look back didn't really yield a lot of results. There weren't a lot of inspections within the past year, which is, okay, let's take that as a positive. So I expanded that a little bit, and we looked at February 2022 through February 2025 as our time period. So it's a 3-year look back on inspections nationwide, and so these were the top 5 that were identified. And honestly, a little bit surprising. Some things that I expected to see in here were not included. So let's move on to hazard communication. I'm sorry, excuse me. Before we do that, I want to give you a reminder that OSHA has continued to raise the level of penalty year after year for several years now. So this is the updated 2025 structure of penalties. So we're now looking at about 16,550 as the maximum for most types of violations, things that would be considered serious other than serious or posting requirements. Any failure to abate penalties, that would be up to 16,550 per day beyond the abatement date. And then the most severe violations, willful or repeated violations, are now at just over $165,000 per violation. So just a reminder, these costs continue to escalate, again, year over year for several years now. OSHA has been doing this, and I think we can probably, I would say, expect that trend to maybe continue, but it's gotten to the point where these are pretty substantial, right? So let's move on then to the basic requirements overview. Let's start with hazard communication. This is a standard that I think within your industry, most of you are very familiar with. There are some significant requirements within this industry that you must adhere to. The standard the number is 1910.1200. This is also known as the Right to Know standard or the Globally Harmonized System, or GHS standard. Within the standard, the required elements are a written program. You have to have safety data sheets maintained and available to employees. So available to employees means at all times. Whatever system you're utilizing for safety data sheets, they cannot be behind locked doors. They have to be available to anyone to consult at their will. Now, that said, I know there are a lot of services out there. There are some online services that provide safety data sheets. There are some services that provide access to them via telephone. If you have them maintained electronically on, let's say, a shared server at your workplace, that's fine. But there has to be some level of kind of contingency. Let's say if your network goes down and you lose power and your computer terminals aren't accessible, right? So what does somebody do then? So you have to kind of think of that. There is a little bit of a grace period for safety data sheets being available. I think it's within 8 hours of request it has to be made available to an employee. These days, generally, a lot of these things are available online, or if somebody had a smartphone and could access, if you have things online or your shared drives, that would be a backup plan, right? So just keep that in mind. You also have to have employee training conducted upon initial assignment and when new hazards are introduced into the workplace. You have to maintain an inventory of your hazardous chemicals along with the safety data sheet. Generally, we suggest that the inventory serves as basically the index. It stays in the front of your, if you have a book of safety data sheets, right, it stays in that book. but you have to somewhere maintain that overall inventory of the products. Labels and other forms of warning, including on secondary containers, have to be in place. You really should have a process for making sure that secondary containers are labeled, or if primary labels are worn off, what are we doing to replace those things? In terms of our labeling, the chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor shall ensure that each container of hazardous chemicals leaving the workplace is labeled, tagged, or marked. You have to comply with both GHS and OSHA. Labels on shipped containers have to have the following elements. So you need to include the product identifier, pictograms, there are 9 of those, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, and then also the contact information, the name and the address and the telephone number of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. So I just want to show you a compliant GHS label. This is pretty typical. So you see we have our identifier up at the top. We have the product name and then the manufacturer or the importer or distributor's information. Precautionary statements on things like general use, precautions for not smoking. We could have things like, the use of some protective equipment within here. So that's just kind of general use statements. Then we also have over on the right side, we've got our pictograms up at the top. These two here signify that we've got a health hazard and this product is a flammable. So then we have associated signal words and hazard statements relating to those pictograms. And then this is supplemental information. Is kind of a little extra, not necessarily required, but they may have some additional information. So this is pretty typical of a GHS compliant label these days. One thing that I do want to mention is that, as you're probably well aware, the standard was updated last year. It went into effect in July, and there's a phased-in approach. There are some different requirements over a period of time that are being required to be put in place. So just be aware of that there was some, update to the standard. Within your industry, as folks who are manufacturers and distributors of products, some of those things are a little bit more applicable than to, a standard manufacturing environment or other workplaces. So please just be aware of that. OSHA does have a frequently asked questions page on hazard communication GHS. It shows the timetable for implementation and what the different measures of implementation are. So maybe something worth checking out if you haven't seen that. Okay, moving on to respiratory protection. So this standard is 1910.134. What the standard requires is that in the control of occupational diseases caused by breathing air contaminated with harmful dusts, fogs, fumes, mists, gases, smoke, sprays, or vapors, your primary objective should be to prevent atmospheric contamination. So OSHA wants you to first look at the implementation of effective engineering controls. If effective engineering controls are not feasible, or while they're being instituted, appropriate respiratory protection should be used. A respirator shall be provided to each employee when such equipment is necessary to protect the health of such employee. So if we don't have any further controls in place and we have potential exposure or known exposure, we need to supply the respirator. The employer shall provide the respirators which are applicable and suitable for the purpose intended. So before we move on, the number one question that we get in terms of respiratory protection is, how do I know when I need to have a respiratory protection program? How do I know what type of respirator I have to use? Well, we've got some sources of information. I would say, generally speaking, a safety data sheet is where you would want to start to know what the product is, look at what the components are. Safety data sheets should identify hazardous ingredients. It should also identify for you what products in there, what ingredients in there have a defined permissible exposure limit, a PEL. And then if we have those identified, that's a good kind of indicator that we probably need to dig a little further, right? Do a little bit more work to find out what our potential exposure is. The basis for any respiratory protection program in my mind is really data. So we need to say, hey, do we have a real exposure? If we don't do any type of monitoring, whether it's atmospheric monitoring or personal monitoring, right? We really don't have a basis for moving forward and making a decision. So I bring this up because it's probably, something that would require the assistance of an industrial hygienist, somebody possibly as a consultant to help you put together a plan, identify what exposures we may have, collect data for you, and then help you interpret the data to implement a program. All right, if we do determine that we do need a respiratory program, we are utilizing it as a written or as a required part of the workplace. We have to have a written program. You have to complete medical questionnaires for each user, so that medical evaluation then has to be conducted by a licensed healthcare professional to clear each person to use a respirator. Not everybody will be permitted to use a respirator. If it's determined through that evaluation that they are not fit for using one, then that person cannot work with that equipment, right? Annual fit testing is then required for each user, and annual training on the use of the respirator is also required for each user of the equipment. What about voluntary use? So we periodically run into this, a lot of questions around this. What do I need to do for a voluntary use of a respirator? So OSHA says that the employer may provide respirators at the request of employees or permit employees to use their own respirators if the employer determines that such respirator use will not in itself create a hazard. Generally speaking, as an employer, if an employee is bringing in their own personal protective equipment, it is the employer's responsibility to assess it and provide permission to use it. This goes for pretty much all personal protective equipment, right? So if an employee does bring in their own respirator, you need to evaluate it. You should not allow them to utilize that until you've done some level of evaluation to determine that it is appropriate and doesn't present a hazard to them. So when we look at using respirators on a voluntary basis, making sure it doesn't present a hazard, that will include looking at the medical evaluation, right? So that's going to be a portion of the written program that we need to implement. If you do determine that the voluntary respirator use is permissible, you should provide a copy of Appendix D. You're required to provide that. Appendix D of the standard is information for employees using respirators when not required under the standard. That's the title of it. And then finally, you have to implement those elements of a written respiratory protection program that are necessary to make sure any employee using a respirator voluntarily is medically able to utilize that respirator. So again, that's the medical evaluation piece that has to be completed. And you also have to ensure that the respirator is being cleaned, stored, and maintained so that it doesn't present a health hazard to the user. So that means basically you have to do some level of training for these users on the basics of, again, maintaining them, cleaning them, storing them. There is a very, very important exception here, and that exception is that employers are not required to include in a written respiratory protection program any employees whose only use of a respirator involves the voluntary use of a filtering face piece. Filtering face piece respirator, also known as a N95 mask. I think everybody is aware of what those are these days. So an N95 is considered a respirator. If it is 100% voluntary, there is no required use of this equipment. All you have to do is provide Appendix D of the standard to the employees. Okay. However, within your determination for respiratory protection use, if you as the employer are saying N95s are required, then all other elements of the respiratory protection program essentially need to be in place because an N95 is considered a respirator. Okay, moving on to electrical. So electrical is a pretty complex set of standards. It's its own entire subpart. So it's called Subpart S, and within Subpart S there are then 14 individual standards, which you can see here. I'm just kind of reading through these quickly. You've got the introduction, you have electric utilization systems, general standards, wiring design and protection, wiring methods, components, and equipment for general use, specific purpose equipment and installations, hazardous locations, special systems, scope, training, selection and use of work practices, use of equipment, safeguards for personnel protection, and then there's an entire section that are definitions applicable to all of the other 13 standards. Okay. The 4 standards that are highlighted there that are in red font, those are the standards that there were citations for in the past 3 years. So I'm going to go into more detail on each of those and show you what those citations were. And then we're going to talk about some of the common things that OSHA would look for in an inspection. Before I move on, I want to talk about what's called NFPA 70E. You're going to hear me talk about this in a few slides. So NFPA 70E is considered a consensus standard. OSHA does not specifically call out or cite or reference NFPA 70E within their standards, right? It's never written in their standards specifically that you shall adhere to NFPA 70E. NFPA is the National Fire Protection Association. They write their own codes and standards. What they've written for electrical safety is generally considered best practice. It's therefore kind of the consensus for what people should be doing. So it's incorporated by reference, and where we get into incorporation is in the standards here, where we've got training, selection and use of work practices, use of equipment, and then safeguards for personnel protection. So I just want to kind of expand on that a little bit, and I'll touch on NFPA 70 here more, but I wanted to explain where that kind of fits into the electrical standards from OSHA. All right, next. So these are the subpart S. These are the specific standards that were cited within your industry. So first of all, general, there was a citation for sufficient access and working space needs to be provided and maintained around electrical equipment to permit ready and safe operation and maintenance of such equipment. So there's a table called S1 within the general standard, and it identifies clearances that are required for equipment. And in this case, there was not enough clearance. 1910-304 wiring design and protection says that all 125 volt single phase 15, 20, and 30 ampere receptacle outlets that are not part of the permanent wiring of the building or structure that are in use by personnel shall have ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel, GFCI protection. So it was a temporary setup, not part of the permanent wiring setup, and it did not have GFCI. 1910-305, within this section, we had wiring methods, components, and equipment for general use. This is a pretty common one, what I call low-hanging fruit for OSHA. Flexible cords and cables shall be protected from accidental damage as might be caused, for example, by sharp corners, projections, and doorways or other pinch points. So any damage to flexible cords and cables is something that could be cited. Any use of a flexible cord or cable in a manner that could potentially lead to damage is something that could be cited under the standard. So as it says here, not through doorways, not through wall openings, right, and other methods that could subject any of the equipment to any damage. Then finally, 1910-307, hazardous locations. All areas that are designated as hazardous locations shall be properly documented. So we have to assess, identify, and then document where we have hazardous areas within our workplace. This section of subpart S, the hazardous locations section, includes 9 different hazardous locations, and they are defined within the definitions standard of subpart S. All right, so a lot of these things, again, this is what I would call low-hanging fruit. These are things that OSHA, frequently cites in a lot of industries, a lot of different workplaces. Yours is no different, right? So electric equipment shall be free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. This is a very broad, very general requirement, essentially saying that everything has to be used as intended. Nothing should be damaged, shouldn't have any exposure to live electrical equipment. So kind of a catch-all. Next, we have listed or labeled equipment shall be installed and used in accordance with any instructions included in the listing or labeling. So this one's a little bit, more vague, I guess. Probably something that a lot of folks aren't really familiar with. What does listed and labeled mean? So listed and labeled means that a nationally recognized testing laboratory, or NRTL, has to have done performance testing for equipment, and then they've listed and labeled it as use in a specific manner, right, for an intended purpose. Underwriters Laboratories, UL, is probably the most commonly known one. They are one of the NRTLs. There are certainly others, but UL is again the most common one. So UL tests components, equipment to certain specifications, says, how are they performing? Yes, we've met a performance specification. It should be used in this certain manner, right? So that is generally speaking, kind of simplifying listing or labeling. One of the most common and probably most overlooked uses of equipment for listed and labeled intention is a simple outlet box. So outlet boxes, if you can picture a 4 outlet box, right? Just a standard box that we probably see in many areas affixed to a wall. So that box, if you look around the perimeter of them, the ones that are typically metal, if you ever see one that has circular, they're called knockouts around the perimeter of the box. So that box is intended to be secured to a wall or other structure, right? So if we find that box on a flexible cord or cable, where I see them is folks kind of make their own extension cords, and they'll take one of these boxes and they put it on the end of a flexible cable, or if it's hanging from a ceiling dropped flexible line. The issue is that box, the knockouts could be pushed into the box. If somebody were to grab the box, their finger could go into the box and then be exposed to the live electrical. So that's not the intended use of that equipment, and that's something that would not meet the listing or the labeling. It's just a simple example. There's plenty of other ones. Another requirement from OSHA: unused openings in boxes, raceways, auxiliary gutters, cabinets, equipment cases, or housings has to be effectively closed to afford protection substantially equivalent to the wall of the equipment. So in other words, we cannot have any exposures of live electrical. We can't have any openings in enclosures or our equipment. Another very common example here is if you open a breaker panel and there's an unused slot in a breaker panel and there's no cover, there's no blank over it, so then you just have a gap there. That's something that would fall under this requirement. There shall be no damaged parts that may adversely affect safe operation or mechanical strength of the equipment, such as parts that are broken, bent, cut, or deteriorated by corrosion, chemical action, or overheating. Again, a pretty broad one, but this spells out, pretty clearly if you have damaged equipment that would fall into this category, it's something that could be cited. All right, and then electrical equipment shall be firmly secured to the surface on which it is mounted. So everything has to be securely, affixed to a wall or permanent setting. Okay, next one, use of temporary wiring. Temporary wiring is defined as something that's not to exceed 90 days. The most common thing you'll see generally under here are extension cords. So extension cords are meant to be a temporary solution, should not be part of your permanent setup. And again, that temporary is very specifically defined as 90 days or less. Equipment wiring methods and installations of equipment in hazardous locations has to be intrinsically safe and approved for those hazardous locations or safe for that hazardous location. So once you've identified we have a hazardous location, the equipment has to match, right? It has to be designed for that location specifically. So when we talk about explosive environments, flammable environments, we're going to have equipment that meets the safety requirements for that location. All right, and then these last 2 bullet points, kind of now we're getting into, we're circling back to NFPA 70E requirements or standards. So except as elsewhere required or permitted by the standard, live parts of electric equipment operating at 50 volts or more has to be guarded against accidental contact by use of approved cabinets or other forms of approved enclosures. So the standard then kind of in another area goes on to say that if that cannot be met, and there's really an anticipated exposure to live parts of electric equipment at 50 volts or more, this is when we have to really take a look at NFPA 70E and meeting the requirements within 70E specifically, and most notably probably is training for personnel. Next, employees working in areas where there are potential electrical hazards shall be provided with and shall use electrical protective equipment that is appropriate for the specific parts of the body to be protected and for the work to be performed. So once again, we have to have a PPE hazard assessment conducted. We have to make sure that it should adhere to the requirements within NFPA 70E. So these are kind of 2 big clues here as to, do I need to look at 70E further? There is actually a table within subpart S. It's called Table S4, and it lists occupations where anyone who's exposed to 50 volts or more has to be trained. And in parentheses, I have included NFPA 70E as the typical training. OSHA does not cite that specifically, but again, that is kind of the consensus what the training should be, right? So, take a look at these occupations and think to yourself, do we have folks in those roles, right? Are we in these occupations? The next question would be, take a look down here at kind of the notation. Workers in these groups do not need to be trained if their work or the work of those they supervise does not bring them or the employees they supervise close enough to exposed parts of electric circuits operating at 50 volts or more. So, if you've got folks who are doing troubleshooting, they're doing diagnostics, and they're taking, control panels off, if they're opening up any kind of equipment and the equipment has to remain on and it's operating at 50 volts or more, that's a pretty good indication that those folks have to be trained according to OSHA standard. And again, through kind of reference, we're looking at NFPA 70E. If you say to yourself, I have no exposure, we are not doing anything where we're exposed to live electrical, we are not opening any electrical equipment, then we probably aren't looking at NFPA 70E. It's a little bit confusing. It's not very cut and dry. But if, hey, you're thinking to yourself, we potentially have this exposure, I would kind of look further into this. All right. So action to take for electrical safety. Conduct routine electrical inspections. We suggest in-house you have an inspection protocol, primarily visual inspection, making sure everything is undamaged, it's secured, it's in good shape, it's not deteriorated. Consider contracting inspections to electricians. So probably a good part of a preventive maintenance plan is an annual electrical inspection. And we also suggest infrared surveys on some frequency, infrared surveys of your electrical equipment, mechanical equipment, breaker panels. Typically, this is done by a qualified electrician. They have to take the panels off, the front of the electrical panels off. So, they need to be qualified to do that. They need to have protective equipment to do that. Infrared surveys, we typically suggest these about every couple of years. NFPA recently increased the frequency, and NFPA says they should be done annually. That is not a requirement. That's not a reference by OSHA. It's just kind of a best practice. All right. Also, having an overall electrical preventive maintenance plan is a good idea. Once again, it should outline inspections. It should outline what are we doing in terms of just upkeep of our electrical equipment. Educate employees on basic electrical hazards. And then here we go. We need to assess activity being done by employees, determine the exposure potential to live electrical, and then that'll lead you to a determination for the need of NFPA 70E training for select employees. Okay. All right. Next, material handling slings. This is not one that I really expected to see in the top 5, but it was in there. So let's talk about kind of the basic requirements from OSHA. So this standard applies to all different types of slings. We have alloy steel chain in here. We've got wire rope, metal mesh, natural or synthetic fiber rope, synthetic web of different types. Could be nylon, polyester, or polypropylene. So these have to be used for hoisting and material handling, right? So within the standard, it defines safe operating procedures for our slings. Some very specific things. There are quite a few actually safe operating procedures that are defined within the standard. It requires that employees have to be kept clear of loads about to be lifted, and they have to be kept clear of suspended loads. So when we are doing any sort of hoisting, we have to have basically a safety zone, a safety area around that operation where folks are not interacting with the hoisted load. Requires the recommended safe working load as prescribed by the sling manufacturer on the identification markings has to be permanently affixed to your sling. So load limits determined by the manufacturer, we should always be able to view those on the slings. And then finally, very specific conditions are defined that require slings to be removed from service due to wear, tear, damage, deterioration. The standard outlines when you need to remove something. There are also requirements for sling inspections. So if you have material handling slings in your facility and you have not done inspections, I would certainly pay attention to this section. So the requirements call for daily inspections. So each day before being used, the sling and all fastenings and attachments has to be inspected for damage or defects by a competent person. The competent person is designated by the employer. Additional inspections shall be performed during sling use where service conditions warrant. So a couple of notable things here. So calls for the daily inspection. It does not call for any documentation of a daily inspection. That is not a requirement, but the daily inspection, visual inspection should take place. A competent person definition, if you kind of look towards the bottom here, that's defined as one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or the working conditions, which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees. Right? So we have to have knowledge in these elements. And then that individual has to have some level of authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate those conditions. So we have to have some level of authority, and they have to be knowledgeable, and you need to designate who those folks are. Okay. A thorough periodic inspection of alloy steel chain slings. So if you specifically have alloy steel chain in use, you need to conduct inspections on a regular basis. And that's determined by the frequency of sling use, the severity of service conditions, the nature of lifts being made, and experience gained on the service life of slings used in similar circumstances. The inspection requirement is a minimum of at least every 12 months, and it has to be documented. So at a minimum, if you have an alloy steel chain sling in service, that sling needs to be inspected and you need to document it once a year. That's the absolute minimum, right? But based on the frequency of use, your severity of service conditions, the hazards within your service area, potential exposure to heat, right? The loads being lifted, hoisted. You should probably increase that frequency. If it's a sling that's being used, it's in pretty heavy service, it's routinely being used, it's being used on a daily basis, I would suggest that periodic inspection probably increase to a monthly frequency. And again, that should be documented. OSHA does not, within the standard, define all these elements that would take you from once a year to once a month. This is kind of a judgment call, but it is something that should be assessed and then determine how often are we doing this. All right, so general action to take here, be familiar with slings used in your facility and the applicable requirements. It's a good idea for those types of slings. Take a look at, the specifics for safe use. Take a look at the specifics for when they should be taken out of service. Determine who your competent people are. Educate competent people on sling safety and conducting the daily sling inspections. And I would strongly suggest that education be documented. And then assess your use of your alloy steel chain slings. More frequent use justifies more frequent documented inspections. You could also possibly consult with the product manufacturer, get their opinion, take a look at what their specifications call for in terms of inspections. It's a good place to start if you're not quite sure of how often you should be doing the routine inspections that are documented. Okay, our last standard is machine guarding of mechanical power transmission apparatus. So this is a very specific machine guarding section. This is not the general machine guarding. It is specifically, as it says, power transmission apparatus. So this applies to all power transmission apparatus, which could include things like belts, pulleys, flywheels, shafting, cranks, connecting rods, piston rods, belts, ropes, chain drives, gears, sprockets, collars, couplings, and more. It's anything that is providing movement for a machine. It's generally not, the point of operation of a machine. It's the power transmission apparatus, right? General rule for everything is that if it is within 7 feet of a working surface, the 7 feet of being accessible, there should be guarding to prevent interaction of personnel. Guards should be affixed to the machine or secured elsewhere if attachment to the machine is not possible. We're going to revisit affixing here kind of towards the end. But some examples of guarding and motion and things that generally speaking are not point of operation, not where work is being done. Could be a rotating motion for drive. Could be a transverse motion. Could be something as simple as a powered belt, right? That is a conveyor belt. Conveyor belts can cause pinch points if they're too close to fixed objects. The drive mechanism on the conveyor belt also needs to be looked at. We'll talk about that in a second. Reciprocating motion, again, it's not a point of operation, but it's moving parts of a machine where power is being transmitted. Maybe something's moving back and forth. We should provide protection against somebody being struck by or caught in that moving part. Some specific things that we run across that I've seen out there on a number of occasions. So if we have any kind of conveyor system, thought this may be applicable for your industry. So on the left side, we've got a raised conveyor belt. The rollers are powered from underneath, and you can kind of see it's a little bit hard to identify, but if we take a look at that picture on the left, the orange portion of the picture, that is actually the guard. So where you can see the separation between the orange portion and the blue frame, that is too large of an opening. And within there, you can kind of see there are belts in there. There's a moving shaft that's driving the rollers up above. So that's the power transmission section of the conveyor. So that orange guard's been damaged, that needs to be put back in place so we don't have an opening that would be accessible. And if you have any roller conveyor systems that are on the floor, similar to what's seen on the right, the missing roller itself really could be our point of exposure. So in this situation, we had a roller that was missing. If you remove rollers from these, underneath there, you often have drive components, whatever's driving those rollers. You've got that motion, right? So then now we have an opening where there's a potential exposure to the moving part. So if you do have rolling conveyors on the floor like these, just be very aware that if you get one roller that's missing, you probably now have a guarding violation that we need to address. And that's typically just replacing that roller. Other specific ones, so OSHA calls for the projecting shaft end of any kind of a drive shaft has to have a smooth edge and end, and it has to project no more than 1/2 the diameter of the shaft, unless it's guarded by non-rotating caps or safety sleeves. So what does that mean? So the shaft end itself cannot project out more than, if we take a look at this photo, we've got you can see the diameter of the white shaft. So from the gray kind of colored coupling here, that shaft should not project more than 1/2 of the diameter measurement, right? Just looking at this photo, I would probably say that this is projecting too far. So then we would need a non-rotating cap. That's why we would need the yellow guard here you can see on the right, put over the end of that shaft, right? So it protects that. Other specifics: unused keyways and shaft ends have to be filled up or covered, so we can't have any gaps that anything could get caught in. So keyways, it's a method of basically attaching a rotating shaft to a piece of equipment. So those keyways, if they are again unused, if there's any gaps, any openings, we have to have some type of a filling in there so nothing can get caught. Generally speaking, as we can see here in the photo, a cover over the top, an end cap, that's typically what we want to try to look for guarding of shafts like this. Okay, design of machine guards. When designing a machine guard, the guard must accomplish the following: prevent the employee contact with a hazard area during machine operation. It should itself not create additional hazards or interference. So the guard itself, you have to be careful that it doesn't create a pinch point or a spot where we could be caught in between motion and the guard itself, right? So it should not create additional hazards. The guard needs to be secure, tamper resistant, and durable. When we talk about securement, this is saying, hey, we have to have this securely attached to the machine or another means that I can't just easily remove this by hand. Typically, you want to have a guard designed and installed where you need a tool to remove the guard. So using a wing nut to fasten a guard to something isn't okay, because I could pretty easily remove that by hand, right? So typically, if you take a look at guarding, needs a tool of some type, shouldn't be easily accessed, shouldn't be easily removed by hand. You also need to design things that allow for safe lubrication and maintenance. So what we suggest is that you conduct frequent guarding inspections to verify that your guards are in place, they're not damaged, they haven't been tampered with, they haven't been removed, and that they remain effective. Okay. And that is it. That's all I have for you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And then I think we can go ahead and open this up to Q&A.
Thanks, Thanks, everybody. I just want to remind you, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A. I have a couple of questions about the slides. Yeah, the slides will be available. We'll send them out by email after the presentation. and as well as a link to the recording of the session. So you will have access to all of that. Let me just kick off with a couple of questions, and then if members have some, they can type them up in the Q&A. We have the top 5 actual violations here that you've covered very well. Does this align with what you would consider to be the top 5 risks?
Holly, I'll take that one, and no. There are certainly risks that exist within your industry that are not represented here. I think of lockout, tagout, control of hazardous energy. That would be one that I would consider a top 5 hazard level, right? Also confined space, not represented here. I would consider that to be one of our top hazard level topics. Additionally, I would lump it all together as working surfaces. Within there includes fall protection and fall hazards. So those are 3 that are definitely not represented that I think are like more from a risk perspective substantial. I would even probably throw in there powered industrial trucks. The use of forklifts in the workplace is something that we see is it's really more substantial in terms of the potential impact and severity. So no, they don't quite align.
Okay. Jeff, what have you heard from members that they tend to get dinged on the most by
I
OSHA?
think probably picking up on what Cullen just said, in terms of when I talk to members, the fall protection, walking, working surfaces has been probably the one that I hear the most, particularly, let's say, guardrails or some sort of handrails, particularly on elevated surfaces around the tanks where trucks are being loaded, as being a common problem. The other one is electrical, even though it's on the list there, that seems to be a common one that gets cited pretty quickly. Lastly, folks, hazard communication standard, folks in the industry have been dealing with this now for almost 40 years in terms of the OSHA standard. Folks say they just haven't updated their written plan. That seems to be a common problem. But, again, circling back, the fall protection, walking, working surfaces seems to be the one that I hear the most about.
Okay. When you have a situation where there are OSHA fines, what are the total costs of an incident? If something goes wrong and someone's found to be in violation of one of these, of any of the regulations, what are we looking at typically?
And I can try, and the other guys can chime in. I mean, typically what I'd use as a rule of thumb is when we're looking, if you Google typical workplace injuries that result from these hazards, the average cost is somewhere between the average direct cost is somewhere between $40,000 and $45,000. So that's medical, downtime, some lost production. But then there's the indirect costs, and typically those would be double. So it would be OSHA violations, legal, workers' comp, carrying things out. And so if you take let's say $40,000, and you take 80, so it's $120,000 without batting an eyelash at that point. So that's kind of, strong incentive for folks to make sure not only in terms of compliance, but the safety on the front end is in place.
And Holly, I'll just interject to say, Jeff touched upon the lost time element and, the workers' compensation, like the direct cost, right, which can lead into, potentially higher experience modifier, which can drive costs. But I think some of the issues that may not be as direct and clients may not necessarily realize as much as, hey, could those additional injuries, could that lead to possible turnover? And then what does that do in speaking to long-term productivity is, hey, we're going to need new hires. And that then brings on the additional cost of onboarding, as well as many times, and Cullen can attest to this, where we see some of our most frequent or most severe injuries are the first few months that a new employee is on the job. So these are some of the hidden costs that go into running afoul of some of the OSHA related issues and the effect that it can have on an organization.
And I would just add to that, Michael, that you got this long-term reputational damage as well in terms of recruiting new people, customers saying, well, geez, they don't operate a safe workplace. So there's a lot that goes with it other than just dealing with the immediate situation.
Yeah. And Jeff, as you are well aware, all of these OSHA, inspections, as I look these up, can identify who the employer is, where they're located, right? So this is all public information.
Yeah. And we look at it frequently. It might be worthwhile, Holly, to add at this point. I mean, just given the change of administrations, and you hear a lot about the president saying for every new regulation, you got to take away 10. And I think it's fair to say that we won't see a lot of new activity, regulatory activity coming out of OSHA. But if Trump 1 is any indication, they're still going to do a lot of enforcement. And you have the state plan states as well out there. So I would expect the enforcement to continue at the same or higher level than it's been over the recent couple of years.
Okay. I got a couple of questions from members. One of them is, would it be wise to assess your electrical program with an arc flash study? If so, what does that study provide?
Yeah, so an arc flash study is part of NFPA 70, so that's a component of it. There are certainly different kind of components within NFPA 70E. So the arc flash study is it essentially is an evaluation of the potential for an arc flash to occur associated with equipment. Primarily, I think you're talking about breaker panels, your main feeds of equipment, right? So it's looking at that equipment. It estimates that likelihood of the event occurring, the likelihood of an injury occurring. It also is an assessment to identify what is the appropriate personal protective equipment to be utilized when working with that equipment. And then typically what you have is labeling of that equipment to identify, again, that hazard category and the PPE requirements associated with the use of that equipment. So yes, absolutely, it's something that is a good measure to take, to look into. Should be done by a qualified electrician, qualified personnel for this type of a study, right? But it is certainly a part of the NFPA 70E standard.
Okay. Do you think it can be shown using data on exposure times in areas where there's good ventilation, plus information on the vapor pressure / density, that the need for a respirator could be justified as not required? Is this would then be in lieu of monitoring?
I'm a fan of monitoring. Monitoring to me is, it is what it is, right? You get a determination. It's pretty clear. It's hard to argue against those results. Otherwise, I think there could be some additional questions as to methodology, qualifications for doing something. So personally, I would suggest sticking with some level of monitoring.
Okay. Someone else asks, are all citations from events / accidents?
I would say no, certainly not events or accidents. No. If there's an OSHA inspection, it's not always triggered by an event or an accident, right? It could be a programmed inspection. It could be conducted under a national emphasis program. It's certainly not always because there has been some kind of occurrence at a facility. No.
And Cullen, I would also add, these can come from disgruntled employees, like whistleblowers. So we've had instances where we've had clients, disgruntled employees that have called OSHA on our clients. So it doesn't, again, just have to be some sort of accident.
Okay. In addition to training, what else does the NFPA 70E require?
So it's a lot about hazard assessment. As you know, the arc flash assessment, that's a component of that. It's also a system of when you get into various, like various work, you have to do a hazard analysis each time you do it, right? So it's a system to set up assessment analysis for the use of personal protective equipment, safe working practices. It's not just training. There's kind of, several different components to it, but a lot of it is really, it comes down to hazard assessment.
Okay. What about the insurance aspect of this? How can violations or avoiding them affect insurance premiums and availability?
I'll take that one. So I don't think it's any secret to the membership how difficult the property market has been in the chemical segment. There's been a lot of capacity, as in a lot of insurance carriers that used to write in the space and who no longer do. And the existing ones have really tamped down some of their existing capacity. And so what I think the impact of it is, you have an already limited marketplace, and by not adhering to what carriers want to see, I think you further restrict yourself, which is going to necessitate the need to involve more carriers when possible, right? It's best to have one carrier that can, write all buildings and inventory and so forth for a company. But I think the further away that you get from some of the things that OSHA wants to see, I think it starts to necessitate the need to involve multiple carriers, which just increases the underwriting cost, which ultimately long term is going to impact the terms of the offering.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I got another question from a member, and this will be our last one because we're about out of time here. Is there a way to combat inspections when it comes to disgruntled employees? What are our rights to fight false claims?
Where do we start? How much time do we have? I mean, certainly there was whistleblower protection under the OSHA statutes for any employee who feels that there's a problem. Typically, it would generate a walk-around inspection, and we unfortunately are subject to a rule adopted by the Biden administration that's being challenged in court in terms of where the OSHA inspector at his or her discretion can include third-party representatives, plaintiffs' attorneys, union organizers, folks like that to do it. Arguably there's a protocol the inspectors follow to come into your facility. Typically, they announce themselves, they present their credentials. If you want, you can force them to go get a warrant. Typically, that's not something we normally advise just because it gets them upset, and they'll find other reasons just to make your life difficult. But I mean, we could probably spend an hour going through this, Holly, in another town hall where having an employee accompanied, taking pictures and following the inspector and making sure that they go into the right areas and things like that. There's ways to mitigate the problem. And while I've got the floor, the other thing I would probably throw in there, particularly with the hazard communication standard, but each of these compliance safety health officers that OSHA has out there conducting these inspections, in order to ensure consistency across the agency with all of these folks, they have enforcement directives. They're basically detailed outlines as to how to inspect for each of these rules. The hazard communication standard, for example, online you can get the compliance directive for the 2012 standard. If you follow that procedure that the inspector does, you've got a real high probability on a compliance basis, you're not going to have a problem from the agency. The other standards similarly have similar enforcement directives. So it's getting on the website, pulling them down, having the safety folks and the committees that you have go through them and make sure that, in fact, you think you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank Jeff, Michael, and Cullen. Michael and Cullen, a great presentation. We really appreciate that. Everyone keep your eyes on your email. The links will be coming out a little bit later, and either later this afternoon or tomorrow, as well as access to the slides. And thanks again for joining us. And I want to thank Chevron Oronite for sponsoring LubeTrends Live. Have a good afternoon, everyone.